Welcome to this grant writing webinar, hosted by State of Washington Tourism, SWT. My name is Matthew Ozuna, and I am the Destination Development Manager at SWT. I will introduce today's webinar on application and writing tips for destination planning and development grants. Please utilize the chat function in Zoom. Say hello. Let us know where you are zooming in from today. Feel free to share your questions and comments in the chat box at any time during the webinar. You can also utilize the Q&A feature as well. Tamara and I will monitor the chat and the Q&A, and we'll try to address those questions and comments near the end of the webinar. But if something is relevant and important in the moment, we'll kindly try to take those. Like I said, Tamara Rice will also be joining us today. She is the Destination Development Coordinator at SWT. You'll be working with Tamara, many of you, if you do submit your grant applications. She will help in the application process, especially with the application portal. We'll try not to focus too much time on the application portal today. Information on that usually pops up with our info session on a specific grant. And Tamara can talk more about the application portal in those webinars, but can follow up with you individually if you're having issues submitting your grant application online. Like I said, Tamara will monitor the chat and help address questions from the audience near the end of the webinar. So more about today's webinar. This webinar will cover application and writing tips for destination planning and development grants. This will include tools and techniques for grant writing, components such as budgets, statements of need, and status reports to the grantor. Grant writing expert Eliza Evans of E² Consulting will be the guest speaker for this webinar. In addition to grant writing basics, which I will briefly cover at the beginning of the webinar, Eliza will apply her advice and critique to the destination planning and development grants from SWT. There will also be plenty of time at the end of the webinar for audience members to direct their questions to Eliza, Tamara, or myself. And Mike Moe is on the line too, so he can probably take a few questions if needed. As a reminder, this grant writing webinar will be recorded and shared with registrants as well as other users on the SWT YouTube channel. For more information on all 9 of SWT's destination planning and development grants, visit the SWT industry website and sign up for the industry update newsletter. Okay, folks, before we dive into our PowerPoints today, I want to give you a bit more background information on Eliza Evans. Eliza is a seasoned grant writer with 19 years of experience securing funding and a proven track record in developing competitive grant proposals. Her experience includes foundation, state, and federal grant programs in a wide range of topics, including health, behavioral health, education, and the environment. Her experience spans all aspects of grant consulting, including identifying funding opportunities, proposal development, and project coordination. She also supports nonprofits through strategic and sustainability planning and develops and facilitates positive youth development workshops. Eliza's deep connection to community and her experiences across the state of Washington fuel her passion for promoting the state's unique offerings. Eliza, thanks for joining us today and getting to know the tourism and travel industry a little bit more with these grants. I know this is a little new for you, but grant writing as a whole is not. So we're looking forward to your expertise today. Like I said, folks, before we turn it over to Eliza, I'll just share a few slides about our the destination development grants at State of Washington Tourism and just some basic grant writing advice that has helped me in grant writing in the past. So I will share my screen with you all. And we'll get started. Okay, folks, thanks again for joining us today. We're looking forward to interacting with you and sharing information throughout the entire hour of this webinar. If we go over the hour, that's okay too. We can stay on for a little bit longer, but after that, we can follow up with you individually, Tamara, myself, or Eliza, if you need that extra help with questions. Just a little bit of background on the Destination Planning and Development Grants from State of Washington Tourism. State of Washington Tourism will administer around $3.5 million in federal grant funds for around 9 programs in destination planning and development. These grant programs will run from 2024 through 2025. They'll be dispersed through a competitive needs-based process in rural and underserved areas of the state. Eligibility include local governments, so county and cities, tribes, chambers of commerce, destination organizations, your local office, CVBs, and other nonprofit organizations that support travel and tourism. These can be museums, they can be attractions or performing arts venues. They just have to be nonprofits. Now, this is also very important too. Your employer identification number, EIN, and your verification letter from the IRS will ask for you to upload that verification letter in the online portal. If you have any questions about that, Tamara can address those at the end of the webinar. Equally as important is the unique entity ID, UEI, and proof of registration with sam.gov. That's also very important for federal grants of this nature, or federal funds, I should say. And we encourage you to work, whatever organization you are, if you're a tribe or a government or a chamber, to work with the local tourism office as much as possible. Again, these grants have to do with travel and tourism, so working with other travel and tourism entities will only strengthen your application. These grants require no match, and so if you do have a cash match, that is great, but we also welcome in-kind contributions, whether they're donations of time or resources. Volunteer time can be quantified. We have a special website and link for that you can quantify an hour of volunteer time in this year. It always changes. It increases with inflation and other things every year, but we can share that with you as well. Tamara, if you have that link handy, if you can pop that in the chat, that would be great. We also have more information on the value of a volunteer hour in our FAQ page as well, so you can get that information there. Just some basic tips, folks. When I'm applying for grants, I figured these things have kind of helped me throughout the years. Spell out a need for the grant. It's a compelling need. Use data, plenty of context, and even storytelling to share the need of this grant, not only for your organization, but for your community. And then more broadly, travel and tourism. Remember, these are travel and tourism grants. Be sure that your budget makes sense. You'll have a budget template or a spreadsheet that you'll have to fill out as part of the application process with the destination development grants through State of Washington Tourism. But you'll also have to kind of write about your budget in the application too. So you want to make sure the actual planning budget document and your writing kind of mirror each other. Sometimes I would a budget template that would not equal up to what the applicant had written in the written portion of the application. So make sure those two pair nicely. It's always a good idea to maybe budget a little bit more in case you have some cost overruns. You can also use a larger budget to maybe kind of negotiate down an overall project budget if State of Washington Tourism comes back to you, or any grantor for that matter, and says, hey, can you do this project with less? So that kind of gives you some wiggle room in negotiation. I think it's also very important to recruit a fresh set of eyes, someone outside your organization, to review your grant application before you submit it. um, especially, if you're a museum and you're focused on history and culture. But again, these are travel and tourism related grants. Maybe someone from the local tourism office can give you a look to make sure everything is relevant, and maybe can even build a partnership with that local tourism office as well. Don't procrastinate. Tamara will probably say that later on the webinar, that these grant applications, they're a lot of work. There's a lot of paperwork involved. There's, like I said earlier, there's some special IDs, some numbers from the federal government that you will need. So don't wait till the last minute. I know one of our grants is due in I think 2 days from now. I hope you're done with it, or well on your way to finishing that application and submitting it. But take plenty of time in the writing, in the gathering of documents, and then asking of questions to State of Washington Tourism, or even Eliza Evans. We can connect you with her. Pay close attention to the details. Make sure you do know the deadlines for grant applications. But if you are selected as a grantee, make sure you stick to the grant timeline and with status reports. And if you have any questions regarding those, feel free to ask. Like I said earlier, there are 9 destination planning and development grants through State of Washington Tourism. They cover research and data, marketing, production, arts and culture, and a special program that's lasts up to 6 to 8 months, our rural tourism support program. And you'll notice that there's a rural tourism support program and a tribal rural tourism support program, just like there's a rural tourism marketing production and a tribal tourism marketing production. So we have some grants specified for our tribal communities in the state of Washington. There'll be more information on each one of these grant programs on the SWT industry website. You'll find Q&As, you'll find more detail there. And you can use your phone. That QR code can take you to the grants webpage on the State of Washington Tourism Industry website. Again, don't forget to sign up for the industry update newsletter. You'll get updates on grant information and other news, issues, and events. Okay, folks, I think I am perfect on time. I will turn it over to Eliza.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see you all here today. So first of all, I just wanted to say hello and thank you and welcome. I've already had my introduction. So I will say that feel free to save my contact information, but understand that with these grants specifically, if you want to book a 30-minute consultation with me, that needs to happen through Tamara. So communicate with her, but I'm always available. If you have other grants you're working on, I'm happy to help out. I volunteer a lot in my community because I know how important this is especially for small nonprofits. So understand also that this is a semester-long class that we're cramming into 45 minutes. So I will go very quickly because I want to give you as much information as possible. And as you take in that information, you can then go, oh, she mentioned this. You can research more and find more information about that. It's easy, these days with Google searches, etc. So let's see. For some reason, there we go. Okay, so I wanted to go over the very basic structure of a grant. Usually, with most grants, you have a statement of need, project or program description, an evaluation section, organizational capacity, budget and budget narrative, and sustainability. This is true of most grant programs, whether they're federal, state, private, nonprofit, foundation. So another way to think of this is the need is what is the problem? The project description is how will you solve it? How will you know how you're doing? That's the evaluation. We need to know that what we're doing is working and how we can show that it's working to others. Why is your organization the one to solve the problem or to be part of the problem solving if you're part of a partnership? What resources do you need to solve the problem? We'll get into more of that later. And how will you keep your solution going when this funding is over? That speaks to sustainability. So the funding is for a one-time project. That's easy. It's, the funding is over, the project happened, it's done. But if it's an ongoing program, how will you keep it going when that money is done? Funding research I wanted to cover just very briefly because it isn't necessarily a part of the writing of the grant, but as you're looking for grant programs, grant funds for your programs, there are a lot of resources. There are federal grants. If you go to www.grants.gov, there's a search engine. You can put in very specific search criteria. You can choose what branch of the government you want to search for. You can look for grants. You can look for contracts. So that's a very valuable tool for federal grants. If you know the grant, if you know the federal department that you want to look for grants from, you can go directly to their page, but this is a source for all of them. It's also where you find a lot of the paperwork that you need for federal grants. Foundation grants, if you're searching for funding through foundation grants, there are a lot of different tools out there. I will say I use GrantStation only because that's the first one I used. It was owned by the person who owned the grant writing company I worked for, but there are plenty of other ones. A good one will have places where you can search very, very specifically. So you can put in exact wording. You can check all sorts of boxes. If there's a certain population that you're focusing on, if it's local, regional, all of those kinds of things. So there are several different, and I would encourage you, if you have a foundation grant searching tool that you love, put that in the chat to share with others. State grants. So in some states, like in Alaska, you can actually sign up for notifications of all grants, and you can say specifically what types. I have yet to find that with the state of Washington, but of course, the Department of Commerce is a great place to look for the kinds of grants that we're working on. Grant calendars. Once you've identified funding sources, it is so helpful to have a grant calendar if you're going to be applying for multiple grants. You would work backwards from the deadline, and you can even look at past grants, especially with federal grants, if they're reoccurring grants. If you don't know when the deadline is, look at last year's grant and get an idea of when that might be, and then work backwards from that deadline. So if the deadline is July 1, you want to submit at least a week before in case you have technical problems. How long do you need to write it? Then before that even, how long do you need for project development? How long do you need for partnership development? So work backwards. For federal grants, at least 6 weeks. It can be less if you have boilerplate language already developed, if you've already written other grants. That can be helpful. Include separate time for program project development. Sometimes you have no choice and you're developing the project as you're writing the grant, but if you can schedule separate time to develop the program, to figure out exactly what the program is, how you'll evaluate it, it'll save you so much time when you're actually writing the grants. Schedule plenty of time for letters of support and commitment, because we all know people are busy. So you can ask for a letter of support and then remind them and remind them and remind them. And I put a note here, templates help a ton with that. If you ever need letters of support for grants, letters of commitment, sending the person not only the request for a letter of support, but a template that they can easily go through, and they can just put it on their letterhead, change it slightly. That saves them a lot of time and simplifies it for your partners. Set reminders, whatever sort of reminder tools you use on your calendars, set alerts. And this will be a living document. This is something that will change. You will update regularly as new funding sources come out. This is sort of a sample of a grants calendar. So you might even, if you know there's a state grant that's coming out soon, when are you going to start looking for public notices to see if it's available? Have that in your calendar. Sometimes with foundations, they want you to contact them. They want you to establish a contact. They want a letter of inquiry. So they have the deadlines. And this you just continue to update throughout the year. These days, there are so many different tools and apps that you can use for this. I'm still old school. I still use a word table, but there are a lot of tools out there that make this a lot simpler. Briefly, I wanted to go over project program development because if you do this before you start writing the grant, it saves you so much time and stress. The simplest way to think about program development, you're developing solutions for a clearly defined problem. So first, understand what the problem is. I always start with a needs assessment. A needs, trying to figure out what are the needs that exist in the community that you can solve. Find all of your data. Then with the needs assessment, you can do a white paper or a case for support that describes the needs, some possible solutions, some potential partners. So you want to define the problem, the environment surrounding the problem. So, is the problem, are people not coming to community because of a stigma associated with your community, because of something bad that happened there once upon a time, because of anything like that? So you wanted to figure out what the problem is. Assess your organizational capacity. What do you already have? What sort of resources do you have that you can put towards this? What past experience do you have in this area that might help you with this addressing the current problem? Create a problem statement. A very clear, concise, one-sentence problem statement can be very impactful, especially if it's the first thing a reviewer reads. Clear, concise, compelling. Those are sort of the 3 C's of grant writing. And then you're developing the solution. So you figured out what the problem is, you're developing a solution. So think about your project design. How will the project work? Who, what, where, when, why, and how? So are there other organizations that are doing this work you can partner with? Are there other experts in the field in your community you can work with? We never want to replicate. We always want to try to not compete. We don't need to compete with each other. We can work together. Funders love partnerships. It always looks good. What actions will you take? What are the day-to-day of this project look like? Where will the project take place? What is the timeline for the implementation of the project? Service delivery, does it have a start and end date? Why is this solution the best way to address the problem? How will this project be implemented, supervised, managed, ongoing? Project evaluation, which I will cover briefly later as well, very briefly. And project evaluation is important because we need to demonstrate, especially when we're writing grants, we need to demonstrate to our funder that we can identify, we can show that our program is working, that our project is working. We have numbers, and we might have numbers of people who attended, number of new contacts, but it also might be comments from people. So there's different ways to gather evaluation. There's metrics, and there's also what people have to say about what you're doing. So I'll get into that later. And budget, what will it cost? Consider looking at typical grant required budget categories. So you can pull up a budget template from a typical grant. You can find those all over and develop your budget before you even start. Remember with a budget, the budget justification is the budget narrative. Often with larger grants, you'll do a line item budget, and then you'll also have a budget narrative. And the budget narrative purpose is to show how you arrived at the numbers. So if you have a staff who's going to be putting 10% of their time in the budget narrative, you would explain 10% of the person's salary because they're responsible for these things associated with this project. And sustainability, if this is an ongoing project, how will you sustain it after the grant is over? Most funders don't want to think that their money is just going to one thing and then disappearing. But again, that depends on the type of project. If it is a one-time project, then you don't have to worry about the sustainability. So evaluation, it's just brief. Again, this is an entire semester long course in and of itself as well. Logic models, hate them, love them, but they really can be super useful tools, both in grant writing and also in project development. And everybody uses different terms for these things from one grant program to another. So don't get hung up on, is it an objective? Is it an outcome? I've seen federal grants use different words for all of these things. So just whatever they say, that's what you go with. So with a logic model, you've developed your statement of need. we discussed earlier, figure out what your goals are, if you have one goal or multiple goals. And then you want to look at what are your resources? What do you have that's needed to accomplish the activities? And again, some funders will ask for what do you have? Others will ask for what do you need? So with the same resources category. Activities or strategies. What activities will address the need, or what strategies will address the need? So you're starting from that statement of need. Outputs, what will you produce? This is very relevant to these grants, the State of Washington tourism grants. Short-term outcomes, and again, different funders define these differently. Whatever they say goes. So generally it's, what positive changes will occur because of these activities over the next 1 to 3 years. How will you measure those impacts, the outcomes? Long-term outcomes, long-term outcome measurement tools. If you have multiple goals, you can put a goal, goals for each line with each of these broken down. Outcomes, or sometimes they call them objectives, should be SMART. So specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and timed. So it might be something like by X date, X number of people will have achieved X. So it's very, very specific. When you start writing the grant, here's one of the most important things, is become an expert on the funding guidelines. So when it's federal grants, sometimes it's called a request for proposals, sometimes a funding opportunity announcement, whatever it's called, it's the guidelines. You need to know your funder. So if it's foundation or nonprofit or private grants, read their website. You can look at their annual reports to see who they funded in the past, what sort of projects they funded, to make sure that you align with those. You can even review IRS 990 forms to see exactly how much they have contributed through grants to different funders. So you can see exactly how much they put their money where their mouth is. And that will help you figure out if they're the right funder for you as well. So when you're doing funding research, that's a good place to look. Guidestar.org is a good place to look at IRS 990 forms. You can also talk to other grantees. So as you're looking through here, you might see, oh, they gave us a grant for a similar project to my buddies over in this other county. I'm going to give them a call and see how this process was for them. I tend to read, I highlight, I take notes. I will sometimes create a summary of the funding opportunities, the guidelines. You can copy and paste it into a Word document, go through and then delete all the extraneous stuff so that all is left is what you absolutely need to know. Sometimes I'll make a summary of it, especially when I'm working with other people who they just need the basics of what their guidelines say. Sign up for notifications. A lot of grant programs through various funders, they might make changes, they might make amendments. That also will tell you when the funding opportunities become available. So in various websites, you can find a place to sign up for notifications. So all of a sudden you're getting emails from that funder, and then when all of the new grants are coming out. Always participate in the funder teleconferences and the technical assistance opportunities. You get all sorts of little hints through those, like this one here today. Read through the FAQs and the Q&As. Sometimes there are very specific things that not all funding guidelines are as clearly written as the State of Washington tourism ones. So there are ones where you will have a lot of questions as you're reading through, especially if it's a 70-page guideline. So reading through the FAQs and the Q&As, as well as participating in the teleconference, is extremely helpful. Ask questions. But make sure you're asking those questions early, because some funders will say you can't ask questions after certain dates. Develop a checklist and timeline. So go through the funding guidelines, the website, everything that is associated with that grant, and look for every single item that they require and create a checklist. If you have multiple partners, you want to make sure that you have multiple partners know exactly what's on that checklist and who's responsible for what. So you want to go through that with them. And when it comes to especially larger federal grants, sometimes they provide a checklist, but you can't solely rely on that. Sometimes you rely on that checklist, then you go to grants.gov and there's a whole bunch of other forms there that weren't mentioned in the checklist. Or there's other items in the attachments, in the amendments that are also required. So you can't just rely on one checklist. You have to go through the document very carefully. Provide more time than you actually need. That goes back to don't procrastinate. Ensure every item is included. So go so carefully through the funding guidelines, because sometimes I have seen on page 36, there'll be a footnote that says, if X isn't included, your proposal will be rejected. And yeah, it's terrible. So, and ask clarification questions early. And this goes to some of the things that Tamara and we're seeing a little bit already. For example, the EIN verification, that is required. A current W-9, make sure that it's a current W-9. These are required, and I know that there's been a lot of questions regarding these. So Tamara is your resource for those questions specific to these grants. This is just a quick sample of what a checklist might look like. Every single item that's required, a description of what it is, where you'll find it, again, if you have multiple people, who is responsible for what by when. With grants, especially again with the larger federal grants and state grants, develop an outline. Your job is to make it as easy as possible for the reviewers to give you a high score. So your outline should mirror the review criteria. Develop a word-for-word outline that follows the score sheet exactly, and I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. And use language from the guidelines, and I'll show you an example of that as well. So this is just, I took a sample from a federal grant of a proposal review score sheet. So this is what a reviewer is looking at when they are scoring, for this grant specifically, but when they're scoring your proposal, this is what a reviewer is looking at. So they're going to take your proposal and they're going to take this score sheet, they're going to read through your proposal and start scoring you. And this is why this exact document right here, this should become your outline. So you'll have a header that's for project description, and 1 initial assessment of community conditions, and then A, B, C, D. This is your outline, exactly in the order of the review criteria, exactly as it appears, and use as much of the same wording as possible. It's okay to shorten all of these, but that helps the reviewer, it helps them give you a high score. If they have to look back to your table of contents to find all of this information because it's here and there throughout the proposal, it just makes it harder for them to give you that high score. So if this is a review criteria I'm looking at, this is my outline. So I've got 4 project description, 1 initial assessment of community condition, A, B, C. And as I start to write it, I'll even say, if A is alignment with the intent of the RFP per section, etc., my first sentence will be the intent of the RFP is, and I will copy and paste the intent from the document right in here, from the RFP or from the guidelines. And then I'll say our project aligns with this intent in the following way. So it's very, very clear. I'm saying exactly what the question they're asking, I'm answering exactly what they're asking. Same here, community condition as they relate to the impact of alcohol use and abuse. I will say the community conditions as they relate to the impact of alcohol use and abuse are. I'm making it easy for the reviewers. I will add more descriptive text in red. Anything that I find in the guidelines that I think will help me in my writing, I'll add that right into the outline in red so that I know later on I'm going to delete that. So if under D, this is in the review score sheet, D has all of these different bullet points. When I write my proposal, I'm going to keep this information in here so that as I'm writing, I remind myself, oh yeah, there were these key points in there I have to make sure that I include. Sorry, I know I'm going very fast. And so I did review a few of the proposals and had a few consultations with people who are applying for this grant. And this is one of the things we talked about that I'm seeing people are doing brilliantly, which is use headers and subheaders, again, so that everybody the people who are reviewing your proposal and scoring it can easily find every key piece of information. Make sure your proposal fits the required format. So sometimes they'll say something like, each page shall have a top, bottom, right, and left margins of 1 inch, 12-point font. Some will say Times New Roman or Arial or whatever they say. I suggest if they don't have a required font, Times New Roman is easy to read and it takes up less space. So if you're working with page limits, Times New Roman is excellent. Also, another great hint is sometimes they will say that you can have a size 10 font in tables. So you can use a lot of tables to save space. I love tables. Writing. Follow your outline, give the funders exactly what they're asking for and exactly where they're asking for it. No baloney. If you don't know how your program works, it will be apparent in your writing. So make sure that you're not fluffing or adding extra language. Be very, very clear, concise, and compelling. Start and end with a point. So this is why we need this project. This is what the program will do. Here's how we'll know it's going to happen. This is why we need this project. And be objective. Avoid statements like this is the greatest program in all the world. Instead, you can use statements of fact. In a 2014 survey, 98% of participants reported 90 days or more of sobriety following graduation, or whatever. Obviously, that is a behavioral health proposal. With budgets, accurate, realistic. Sometimes I have people who say they want to apply for the full amount, even if they don't need it. So they'll try to kind of add fluff into their budget. And I will tell you, I've actually reviewed grant proposals for the federal government, and people see through that. So ask for what you need, not for what you want. Make sure that your budgets are realistic. If you include in kind, make sure you specify where that's coming from. So if it's coming from other funding sources, what are those sources? If it's volunteer time, how did you come to those hours and those amounts, which you have a link in the chat to help with that. And in the budget narrative, you walk the reviewers through how you determined the amounts and why they're necessary. But also, this is key, the budget narrative should support everything you've already said and not add anything new. So if all of a sudden in the budget, if in the narrative proportion or proposal earlier, you've listed all of the staff that you need for this project, and all of a sudden in the budget, you're asking for funding for a different staff, that will raise a red flag. So make sure that the budget matches the proposal. Evaluation. So much fun. Evaluation is how you will demonstrate success. So we've, in specific with these proposals, I've talked to a few of you about what metrics can you use? Metrics being actual numbers can you use to demonstrate the efficacy of your program? So can you look at jobs created? How many jobs were created? Can you look at increased contacts? Can you, if there's a specific tourism site, new visitors? So actual metrics, but you can also do, if you're working with partners, you can do surveys with the partners that say, how did this go? What could we have done better? You can get anecdotal information as well. I think a balance of metrics and then anecdotal. Anecdotal might be, for example, a tourism group that comes through and afterwards writes you an amazing review and says, this town put together the best, whatever this thing was that I attended, it was excellent, we will definitely be coming back. That sort of information is good. And also, it's a tip for later, but I'll mention it now. In your proposal, depending on the type of proposal you're doing, if this is allowed, you can use text boxes to make things like that highlight. So you can insert text boxes in that have a few powerful quotes from people who love what you're doing, or very strong statistics that really highlight the need. That will make your proposal stand out. So that's what I have an example of right here. So we don't want flowery language in grant proposals, but you can absolutely put in heart. So these are examples of quotes from people who participated in the program, from a senator, Senator so-and-so, very famous. And then also an example of, taking some data for the needs section that makes the need really stand out, and just doing a little text box that highlights. Follow the rules. There's that whole terrible old adage, the golden rule of grant writing is they who have the gold make the rules. So I can complain like crazy about the HRSA new access point grant and how terribly written it is and how cumbersome. But if I want to apply for that funding, I have to follow those rules. There's nothing I can do to change them. There are other ways to fight the system, but this is not one of them. So follow the rules in terms of formatting, required attachments. That's where you've got all of those in your checklist to make that easier. Deadlines, page limits. Sometimes they will say specifically, do not include. Make sure you're reading those. I've seen some lately that say, do not include resumes, but do include CVs, or I can't remember what the other term is they're using now. Anyway, but just make sure that you're making sure that you see what not to include as well as what to include. Cite your sources when you're using data. It enhances your credibility. So if you're using data, if you're using quotes, make sure you cite those sources. Follow whatever APA standards that you choose, whatever is within your organization. Have someone else read your proposal. That's proofreading is super helpful. It's a little off color, but I once left the letter L out of the word public in a document. Yeah, that was very embarrassing. Thankfully, the third set of eyes caught that, because that's not the kind of mistake that will stand out when you're just reading through quickly. And ask for feedback from program people who you work with. If you can ask for feedback from people who participate in your programs, colleagues, peers, partners, that's extremely helpful. Sometimes, also having somebody read your proposal who's not familiar with what you do, so that they can say, wow, you've used all these acronyms, I have no idea what any of this means. And you go, oh yeah, right, I forgot, because it's so much a part of my life. And again, add impact to those text boxes with key data, powerful quotes. They can really help your proposal stand out. This is the very last thing that I do always, in the last, not the last thing that I do, but in the last week before I'm going to submit a final proposal, I will print out the reviewer's score sheet, and I'll use it as if I were a reviewer. And I will go through my proposal side by side with that reviewer's score sheet and look to see, if I were reviewing this proposal, how would I score it? And you can even have a colleague do this. If you have someone you work with who you think would be great at this, hand them your proposal and that reviewer's score sheet and ask them to go through and score your proposal. There are also some funders will allow you to submit your proposal early. And they will tell you exactly, it has to be 75% completed, you have to submit it by this certain date, and they will review it. There are technical assistance programs that will do that. And we are doing that with these grants. So be sure that you take advantage of all of those opportunities. But this one is really key, because sometimes as you're writing, you feel like I've done everything, I've included everything, but doing a side-by-side with the review criteria, you can find some key point that you might have missed. Other tips, read successful proposals. Thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, you can actually see successful proposals from any federal grant program, but just know that that process can take like up to 6 months. So if you're looking at some huge federal grant, it's good to do that very early. Stay current on trends and buzzwords, which change regularly, and yeah, that's fun. Sign up for grant notifications. I mentioned that earlier, but that's important in case something has changed with the grant program that you're applying for. Read your reviews. When you submit grants to some funders, like state and federal funders, they will send, you can request, but sometimes they just send you the reviewer's scores. So you can see exactly where they scored you high and where they scored you low, what weaknesses they identified, and you can use that to improve in the next years. You can use that to improve both in other applications, but especially if you plan to reapply for that same grant in the future. So reading those reviewer comments is extremely important. Another great way to become an excellent grant writer is become a reviewer. So a lot of the federal grant programs, they're looking for reviewers all the time. And that's extremely helpful because you get to see the process from the other end. You get to see how they're reading the proposals, what discussions happen, what key points they raise, what brings up red flags for them as reviewers. And treat your funders like partners. This is especially true, I think, with the smaller local foundations and nonprofits. You're working together in this. You're working as a team to address these situations, make these improvements. Save your outline. I always say if you're working on a big proposal, save the outline and then save, I find it most helpful to save it as version 1, version 2, version 3, so that I always know which is the most current version. If you save things with other sort of, Eliza edited on February 27, well, what if I edit it at 8 a.m. and then again at 10 p.m.? Oops, which is the current version? So version numbers are super helpful. Confirm version control. Oh, if you're working with partners, with colleagues, and you're all working on the proposal together, make sure that you know who has version control, because I've seen it happen repeatedly where we're working in it as a Word document, and one person is editing the document over here, and another person is editing it over here at the same time, and then we have to figure out how to merge those two documents, and it's a ton of time and hassle. So make sure if you have multiple people working on the same proposal, you know who is working on it when. I always suggest that with the online applications like this one is, work in a Word document. Do all of your work in the Word document, because we all know technology crashes, issues come up, things go wrong. So if you have a Word document, you can perfect everything there, then copy and paste it in. It also then, that way you can share that document with your colleagues more easily than giving them the link and the login and the password and all of that. So that is it. Whew, that rushed. I know that was a lot of information. So hopefully we have some time for questions.
Well done, Eliza. Thank you for all of that. And yes, we're right on time. We have about 11 or so minutes for questions. So audience, this is your time to ask Eliza, Mike, Camera, or myself questions regarding the applications for the destination development and planning grants, or more specifically, any kind of grant writing strategies that Eliza or I mentioned earlier today. Ronnie and who was the other person? Was it Annie? Yes, Annie and Ronnie, I answered your questions in the chat. Tamara has done a great job at answering questions in the Q&A. And I see another question. Is there a score sheet for this grant? Well, there's a score sheet for all of the 9 grants, and I can share what State of Washington Tourism, how we weigh the questions. And I can share my screen and we can kind of tackle that right now. In the meantime, folks, go ahead and think about questions and put those in the chat or the Q&A, but I will share my screen and we can kind of go over how State of Washington Tourism scores questions, if I can figure out
And
how
just
to
real
share.
quick, while Matthew is doing that, I can mention that when you look at scoring, you'll see, some questions are weighted more heavily than others. So if you're really struggling with how to fit all of your answers into a tight space, you can think about, well, this question is worth 20 points, this question is worth 5 points. So I need to put more of my focus into the 20-point question.
Yes, thanks, Eliza. So for instance, we weigh these by percentages or points, and this is kind of how the makeup of just one scoring in the arts and culture grant. So they're all a little different for all of the grants. If folks, we can give the breakdown of the scoring to you if you ask for that. And I believe that, and Tamara, correct me if I'm wrong, but people might actually see the percentages, the weight in the application, the online application portal. So folks know, okay, this I should spend a lot more time on this question because it's weighted so heavily. I should probably use the right language, maximize the word limit. I like Eliza's comment earlier. It's not flowery language, but a lot of heart and passion, context, data, statistics, all of those will help you.
Hi, Matt. Yes, the percentages are in the application questions for each grant.
Oh, excellent. Okay, thank you, Tamara. I see another question. Sherry Wyatt, is it possible to indicate statewide impact rather than just one region? Same question about legislative districts. Can you indicate statewide versus just one region? Go ahead, Mike.
Sure. Yes, you can do that. I think, the impact for the state is always important. Obviously, we'd love to see it in your own region, but if you, for example, are representing a film industry, that covers the whole state, then that makes sense for what you're doing.
And there are times when it depends on the type of grant program you're doing. There are times that the data that you're looking for actually doesn't exist for your community. So a lot of times when that happens for me, I will say, this data is not available due to data suppression. Therefore, we have included county data or state data or national data.
Well said. Thanks, Mike and Eliza. Yeah, my first thought was, well, it depends. I'd always focus on kind of the more specific local data first, but yeah, if that's not necessary and depending on your grant project and the type of organization you are, if you're kind of statewide, that totally makes sense.
Well, one thing I want to mention is that, we try to tailor the grant questions to try to cover everybody, but it's not going to cover everybody. I had somebody ask me like, well, we're in this one area that's not, it's in the mountains, but it's technically part of Metro, Puget Sound. Do we have to put that, or can we put another region? Well, no. I mean, you're in King County, so you are Metro Puget Sound, even if it doesn't pertain, that name doesn't really pertain to your area. We understand the context. We understand most of the organizations in the state and who you are and where you're coming from, what you're representing. So just try to trust us, to understand. If you're giving us the information that we need, that's more important than necessarily making sure that exactly answer the question. Just we understand that there's going to be differences from each organization, and we'll be on top of that.
But just to add to that, if you are applying though to a federal funder, that is one case where you do need to explain those things. Yeah. So for example, when I'm writing a grant proposal for Fairbanks North Star Borough of Alaska, I always explain that that's a land area the size of the state of New Jersey, and things like that to put it into context for when it's a federal grant and they don't know the area. But in case we're lucky here with the state of Washington Tourism, we have very understanding staff.
Yeah, and because we're out there, we know most of you, so that makes it easier. And if there is something that you want to explain, then do so. But we're on top of it.
Excellent, folks. We have 5 minutes left in the webinar today. Are there any other questions or comments? I see one from Lindsay. Is there anything specific, perhaps different program past SWT grants that will be required during final reports for these grants that should be kept in mind during the application process?
I would say that it's mostly the rules that we have to follow, because this being federal money. In the past, the money was our money that we could just kind of do what we want with it. But there are, more specific rules around, first of all the information we need from you. When it comes to the UBI numbers, or not, I'm sorry, the UEI numbers, it's not only you, but any subcontractor that you have also has to have that. The rules don't change from the federal government through the state, through us to you until they hit the subcontractor that you're using. So you have to keep that in mind. The other thing you have to keep in mind is the money that you get. We're going to give it to you up front, but anything that you pay to the subcontractor, the work has to be done first, and then you reimburse the subcontractor, because that is part of the rules. So keep that in mind.
And I wanted to bring up also with the UEI number, it's not just a matter of getting your UEI number. You actually have to be registered with the UEI for this grant funding. And if you have questions on that, please just send me an email, and I'll pop my email address in the chat, and I can clarify that for you.
Yes, good tidbits of information, Mike and Tamara, that I failed to mention earlier. Yes, specific gold nuggets of information, very important. Okay, well, Eliza, any parting words of advice before we sign off today?
I think one of the things to think about is it will always take more time than you think, and there may be all sorts of glitches, especially when you're applying online. So I used to be a big procrastinator, and then I became a grant writer. You just can't, because there's only so many hours you can put in. There's only so many hours your brain and your eyes can handle it. So starting early will save you so much stress. And then the extra pairs of eyes and brains is incredibly helpful. As much as possible, use partnerships.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. Well said, Eliza. Thank you, Mike and Tamara and Eliza. You're a great guest speaker. We hope to work with you in the rest of this year and into 2025. So you'll be seeing all of these folks on grant webinars and in-person workshops in the future. So Eliza, Mike, and Tamara, please stay on for a few minutes after the webinar, and I'll stop the recording. And we'll see you again soon, folks. Thanks for joining us today.